Welcome everyone to today's FS Club webinar, and we're delighted to welcome John Knights, who is the chairman of Leadership Global, and he's going to be talking about leading beyond the ego. And I imagine many of us have actually worked in organizations where that would be a great thing to have happened. My name's Robert Pay, and I'm an associate of CN, and it's my pleasure to be chairing this event today. But I can only do so thanks to the generosity of our sponsors, who allow us to range freely and widely across technology, economics, and finance. My job is to get out of the way as quickly as possible and hand over to the speaker, but some housekeeping notes first. The slides are actually already available for download in the chat and on the FS Club website. And we'll be holding a 20-minute Q&A session after John's presentation. So please make sure to use the GoToWebinar chat facility to send in your questions, which I'll feed into the debate. Over the next 25 minutes, John's going to unpack this important topic. And in true FS Club fashion, have your trigger fingers ready, because there's going to be a few polls. John, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak to your members. I'm just going to go into show screen. There we go. Everything okay?
Yep.
So today I'm going to be giving you some idea of how we believe that we should go about creating leaders and helping leaders to work beyond their ego, because we believe that that's actually what future stakeholders are going to expect, and we'll be going into that. I'll be going to that a little bit more detail. What I'm going to try and do is to just give you an overview of the kind of journey that people need to go on to lead beyond the ego, and also give you just a couple of quick dives into the kind of thing that we do, so that you will hopefully get a couple of specific takeaways. The thing is jammed. Sorry. So a month ago, we were beginning to see the end of COVID as a pandemic and able to take stock of what we've learned, thinking about the important issues for the future, and particularly about future generations and their expectations. And we can see below the sort of the key issues that we're facing in this rapidly changing world. And then came conflict, which kind of personalizes as an heroic, almost Mandela-type leader versus a psychopath. And generally weak leadership from the West. So in this rapidly changing world that we're going through, it requires a different kind of leadership. It requires leadership that's more distributed and decentralized, yet inclusive and emergent, and more values-based and more caring. These are key words for our future leaders. So before we go any further, I'd just like to do one quick poll to see where all you guys are in thinking about the future leadership challenges. So what do you feel will present the biggest leadership challenge in your working lifetime? There are 5 options there. And if we can have a answer as quickly as you can, instinctively, rather than thinking too much about it.
So there's 5% for multi-generational organizations, 27% for artificial intelligence, 23% for societal attitudes, 14% for globalization, and 32% for climate change.
Wow, okay. So that's really interesting. Climate change has the highest percentage there, followed by artificial intelligence and societal attitudes. multi-generational organizations and globalization seem to be less important. But I think just to bear in mind then, as we go through this, that we've got artificial intelligence, climate change, and societal attitudes are the three key challenges that you believe we have during your working lifetime. Okay, let's move on. So when we take people through this journey to become, to lead beyond their ego, we call them transpersonal leaders. And so what I'll be showing you is something about the journey to become a transpersonal leaders. And we put it in the context of three types of intelligence: rational intelligence, emotional intelligence, and spiritual intelligence, or if you don't like that word, you can use ethical or value-based intelligence. Rational intelligence is where most of our focus is these days, on our learning and development. Emotional intelligence is becoming more accepted, but it's more accepted in its absence in a way. And spiritual intelligence is something that people find difficulty grasping. But if we're going to get performance enhancing in our organizations, we need to combine the rational and emotional. If we want to have caring and sustainable organizations, we need to combine the spiritual and emotional. And if we want ethical organizations, we need to combine the rational and the spiritual. And we see that the transpersonal is right in the middle there in that red spot. One of our problems is that when we're talking about leadership is that everybody thinks of changing the world, but no one thinks of changing himself, as Tolstoy would have said. I add the bit about herself 100 or nearly 200 years later. But I think it's really important that we think about this, because nobody can really change the world, make a difference, unless you look at changing yourself. We look at changing ourselves. So this is a short, quick picture of the journey that we take leaders on to think beyond their ego, to think as transpersonal leaders. Those three blocks on the left are the sort of typical ways that leaders develop in today's world: business and organizational skills, strategic thinking, vision and direction. But to be really good leaders for the future, they need to really strengthen their emotional intelligence and their ethical intelligence or spiritual intelligence. First of all, that column there, Real 1, is about behaviors and shaping performance enhancing cultures. And Real 2 is about increasing values, ethics and judgment, and going beyond the ego for the greater good. And that's the journey I'm going to be taking you on today. In that journey, there are 17 individual steps. And normally in our programs, it takes about a year for an individual to go through the program, but I'm not going to go through the detail here. There are basically, again, going back to these three this hierarchy of intelligence, these three intelligences of the rational, intellectual, behavioral, emotional, and values, ethical, transpersonal. What we need to think about is, when we think in a neuroscience way, is that our rational intelligence is something that we're born with. We know at birth pretty much what the maximum potential of intellectual intelligence is. Very few people reach it, of course, but there is sort of a maximum. It's hardwired. In our emotional awareness, though, emotional intelligence, totally different. We're able to develop this throughout our lives. We can rewire it, and I'll explain that a little bit as we go through this session. And then finally, the spiritual, transpersonal, ethical intelligence, we can only use effectively by bringing to full conscious. These values are usually hidden subconsciously in our brain, and if we're going to be the right kind of leader, we need to bring them to full consciousness. So we have this circle of awareness, improving behaviors, increasing consciousness, and utilizing values. So let me first of all take you through what we call the intermediate level, which is going beyond the visionary and the strategic. What we have to think about is that we are basically still the same human being as Stone Age man. When we are born, a baby is virtually the same. The difference between an adult today and an adult in the Stone Age is the experiences that they get, the education and the learning and the society that they live in. But we have to also understand that a lot of this is serendipitous. It's by chance. You know, we don't choose what education we get. We don't choose where we're born. We don't choose what parents we have, etc., etc. So what happens is that a lot of what is in us as an adult is still a default from the Stone Age. For example, our tendency to react when we're angry, for example, it tends to amplify the negative. We like to keep doing more of the same. We're prepared for the worst, and we tend to exhibit powerful emotions. These are all things that Stone Age man did. So we have to think about how can we overcome that. So what we're trying to do in this program is to accelerate how people learn to react in a different way. And I'm just going to show you a graph of a small part of the human brain. If we look at the bottom left-hand corner there, we see that all our 5 senses enter, and they're the sort of the main messages that we get from the outside world, come into the thalamus, and then through electromagnetic pulses go to different parts of the brain. And the most natural and easiest way for these signals to travel is directly to the amygdala, which is where we get our emotional response. And this happens very fast, very short. And so that's typically why when somebody gets angry, they might reach out to hit somebody. But as human beings, as mammals first and human beings secondarily, the prefrontal cortex is developed in the human brain. And that gives us the opportunity to rationalize before we react. So what's happening in our brain subconsciously is that we are trying to get the senses to go through the prefrontal cortex rather than directly to the amygdala, so that we can slow down and rationalize what kind of decision we're going to take. And preferably it will even go through the hippocampus, is where our memory banks are. So this is about how to manage our emotions, which is really important. And we can learn that proactively. If we look at emotional intelligence, there are basically 4 parts to emotional intelligence: self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, and relationship management. And you'll see that these are split into 19 subcategories, which we call capabilities. And within each subcategory, there are 4 specific granular behaviors. So emotional intelligence is basically made up of 72 granular behaviors. Most of us are pretty good at most of them, but do we know which ones we're not good at, which ones we are best at, which ones we need to improve? Now, we obviously don't have time to go through this in any detail either, but I want to take just one of these EI capabilities, empathy, and show you how it breaks down into the 4 granular behaviors. Empathy is, in all our research, shows that empathy is the one area where most leaders need to improve or develop. And it's very difficult when you say to somebody, you know, you need to improve your empathy. How do they react? It's a very complex thing. How do you grab hold of it? Well, the way to do it is to break it down into the granular behaviors that it's made up of. And I'll just go through the 4 here in empathy. To listen attentively. We can all learn to do that effectively if we really want to. To demonstrate an awareness of other people's feelings. We can do that as well. In fact, that is probably the #1 singular granular behavior that leaders need to develop, is to feed back that they've heard and understood what the other person has said. And then the third is to identify the cause of that person's perspective and to express an understanding. So those 4 granular behaviors enable you to learn to become more empathetic. It's the same with the other 19, the other 18. We also developed this into 6 leadership styles based on the famous Goleman-Boyatzis model. What is interesting here is that in most organizations, particularly large organizations, we see that pace setting and commanding dominate, where actually visionary, coaching, affiliative, and democratic are much more productive, much more effective for the long term. Now, each of these leadership styles are made up of 3 or 4 of those sub-emotional intelligence categories. So they make up about 12 or 16 granular behaviors. So to be competent in each of those leadership styles, you need to be good at 12 to 16 granular behaviors. Most individuals are probably pretty competent in 13, 14, maybe 15, but there'll be one granular behavior in each of those styles at least where that person could improve their behavior and competence. And that's where we see the most impact on people improving their leadership is by identifying those granular behaviors that they could work on and improve. And then this moves over into how a leader or how leaders develop cultures in organizations. If we look at a typical culture in an organization, and this is typical based on a lot of research working with a lot of companies, we see that power is the parameter that is the strongest, followed by structure, achievement, and then support is the lowest. Yet if you ask people what is their ideal culture, around the world, in any culture, in any society, in any sector, we find that people want achievement as number 1, support as number 2, structure as number 3, and power as the lowest. So how do we get from one to the other? We get to it through changing the leadership styles we use, and because of that, changing the granular behaviors that we have our leaders utilize. Okay, so this was all about behaviors. Now just moving quickly onto the advanced level of our program, where I'm going to focus on the values side of things, particularly around self-determination and personal conscience. Bringing values to full consciousness. First of all, we have what we call personal conscience values. These are about who I am. And you'll see that there are some that, are fairly typical, like truth and honesty, excellence, integrity. But there are some there that are less often thought about in becoming a good leader. Humility, vulnerability, fairness, patience, forgiveness, altruistic love. These are all important, parts of a personal conscience values. And what we are finding in what people expect of their leaders, much more in the last 10 or 20 years, these softer values have become more important to followers. If we move on to the second set of values, which is self-determination values. So this is not about who I am, but more about what I'm going to do with who I am. It's about action. And this is really important, is how do we use those personal conscience values to actually move forwards? This is about motivation, energy, courage, resilience, etc. These are probably the most important single characteristics of a leader, is how you use these self-determination values. Notice that continuous personal development is an important part. So the next thing to think about is what drives you. What are our drivers? The problem is that some of the drivers are about our ego. So I'm just going to ask you quickly a question for you to reflect on is, what is the main driver of your ego? Is it power, prestige, recognition, reward? Now, none of these things are immoral. None of these things are wrong. But the thing is that if you're a leader in an organization, your priority has to be to the organization. And therefore, we have to be able to manage these drivers. I can say quite honestly that in the past, my main driver was power. It was something that I had to learn to manage, sometimes successfully, sometimes not so successfully. Today, if I'm honest again, it's prestige. But I have to manage it because I can't be effective if I've put too much focus on being admired and respected. So it's really important to just be able to bring that to full consciousness. So you have the opportunity, we have the opportunity to either be personal ego-based leaders or what we call transpersonal leaders in the interest of all stakeholders. And here we're going to move to the second poll. So the question is, first, who is the most important stakeholder in your business today? We have 5 choices. I would like to have had 7 or 8 choices, but the technology doesn't allow that. So we've got 5 choices. Who is the most important stakeholder in your business today?
We're up to about 75% of the audience voted now, so I'm going to close the poll.
Can you tell me what the percentages are? Because I can't see them, unfortunately.
Yes, so 12% voted for shareholder / senior executives, 36% for staff or employees, 36% for customers, 0% for suppliers, and 16% for community or the planet.
Okay, that's great. So let's, before giving any comment on that, let's move to the next poll, which is the same question, but well, the question is different. The options are the same. The question is, who needs to be the most important stakeholder in your business for success in the future? Same options.
All right, and the votes are just coming in now. About half the audience voted. I'll leave it open for a few more seconds so everyone gets a chance. And I will just close and share the results now. So this time around, shareholders and senior executives are 4%, staff and employees 22%, customers 44%, suppliers 4%, and community and the planet 26%.
Okay. So that's really interesting. We see that shareholder senior executives go down from 12 to 4. Staff and employees go down from 36 to 22. Customers up from 36 to 44. Suppliers from 0 to 4. And the community and the planet from 16 to 26. So we see that customers are still the most important, both before and after. And the community, the planet, is probably got the greatest increase. I just wonder whether, as we go into the future, that suppliers might take a bigger proportion. I think that suppliers in the past have often been forgotten about, and we're seeing both during the pandemic and during the recent invasion of the Ukraine, that supply is becoming increasingly important. So it'd be interesting to watch that. Okay, let's move on. A couple of deep dives now, just to finish off with. One is about decision making. One of the things that we tend to be taught of in school, in universities, and in our careers is to think rationally and logically. And in a way, this is kind of natural because it's the only conscious decision-making process we have. But there are 5 decision-making processes, and the others are various levels of subconscious and non-consciousness. So we've got intuition, which is basically decision-making based on our experience, our personal experience. Instinct is based on, if you might say, our forefathers' experience. It's innate, what's in us, what's in our genes. Insight is based on that aha moment, that light bulb coming on. It's a voluntary feeling that you get when something from the recent past comes into your mind and puts on the light bulb. And finally, ethical philosophy. This is a very interesting one, because what we found with lots of research of hundreds of thousands of people is that ethical philosophy breaks down into 3 simple categories. Do you follow the rules? Do you have a social conscience? Or do you believe in, if you like, integrity, in doing the right thing? And we all have a balance between those, but it's interesting that about 1/3 of the population have each of those 3 as their priority. So it's follow the rules, personal conscience, and integrity. And if you're dealing with somebody who has a different ethical philosophy, it can sometimes be quite difficult. So it's very useful to understand a person's ethical philosophy, as it is their intuition and instinct and insights. So what we need to do if we're to make decisions more effectively is we have to bring those subconscious processes to a higher level of consciousness. So be thinking through, why am I coming to this? Why am I feeling this decision? And working it through, and then using the rational logic to understand it better. Another thing to think about in this area of transpersonal leadership is what is my purpose? Do you think everybody should have a purpose? Or do you think it's a waste of time? A couple of questions you can ask yourself here is, do I think strategically about my life and what is to be achieved for the greater good? Do I understand my goals in life and the purpose it represents? And we haven't got time to go through this today, but this is something you can refer back to the slides and maybe think about, what is your purpose? And then how do you connect the purpose, how do you connect that purpose to your organization's purpose? Is it aligned? Does it need to be aligned? We think it does. And then finally, we like to think about developing a touchstone for every major decision that a leader makes. We have the transpersonal qualities on the right-hand side: caring, radical, ethical, authentic, sustainable, emotionally intelligent, performance enhancing. If you're making a decision and they don't cover those 7 characteristics or qualities, then you need to think hard about whether it is the right decision. You also need to add on, what are the core values that you have? For me, it's integrity and fairness are the things I feel that are really me, whereas humility and altruistic love are things that I want to work on and want to improve, and as well as courage and resilience. So you can set a standard by which you're going to be judging your decisions. We don't have, again, something we don't have time to go through today, but I've put a slide in there and the pack if you want to download it, so you can think about what would be your touchstone. And you can choose between these various personal conscience values and self-determination values, or others as you feel fit. Okay, so that's just a quick dive of the kind of journey we take people on, and we believe people need to go on to become a transpersonal leader, which is where we think the future is if we're going to change the world for the better. And just remember what Professor Dumbledore said, it's our choices, Harry, that show us what we truly are, far more than our abilities. Okay, I've rushed through that. I hope I did it within the time frame. I think so. So thank you very much. And I'll leave this this last slide here so that you can have a quick look at the various references to transpersonal leadership. And if you want to click on the QR code or take a photo of the QR code, then you'll contact me directly on LinkedIn. Thank you, Robert.
Well, thank you very much indeed for bringing such insight and clarity to such a complex topic. I have a question here from Hugh Purser. He didn't give his pronouns, but the question is, do women have far less to travel to lead beyond ego? And I'm sure you've got a lot of insights on this.
The short answer is yes. In fact, of the 19 EI capabilities I showed in that chart, in our research, women on average, and I state on average because it's not all women or all men, that on average women are superior in 18 of them. Wow. The only one they're not superior on is on self-confidence.
Right. But interesting. Given you know, your long experience, is there some? Can you give us a sort of short case study of something that would throw some of these points you've been making into relief? I mean, you know, we were talking before about you know, some of the organizations that you work with. So if you'd like to just sort of maybe bring out some of those points from a short case study now, that would be great.
Okay. Well, I think that what we see is that over and over again is that senior management teams that are more balanced between men and women operate in a quite different way than all male or even all female boards or senior leadership teams. And they are more effective. They listen to each other more. They are less competitive and more collaborative. So I think the answer really is getting a balance. But I think that to get a balance, we have to acknowledge as men, you know, unfortunately men still dominate. So men have to be believers in that bringing more women on to senior leadership positions is a good thing. And I strongly believe that. So I think that balance is really important. I think also that in terms of values, I think women are much more able to show their soft values, things like vulnerability, like humility, not necessarily patience, but forgiveness, for example. And we still, you know, men have to fight off that sort of macho thing, which is inherently default in us.
Right. Okay. I have a question here from Vile Polinin, and question is how to deal with narcissists. Should one hope for healing or simply try and get away?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think that if we've got narcissists or psychopaths or sociopaths, the chances of curing them is pretty remote, and that would be potentially the role of a psychiatrist rather than you know, somebody who's trying to develop leaders as a coach or facilitator or whatever. I think the answer is that, you know, we have this thing about you know, comparing an eye for an eye versus turning the other cheek. And I don't want to be religious about it, but I think that, you know, there are, in general, leaders need to give people a second chance and need to try to help people to find a solution. But there are those times when you're coming up against people where you've just got to be tough and get rid of them.
Right. Okay, thanks for that. There's a question here that came to me from someone who really wanted to be here this afternoon but couldn't. And she wanted to know, do you detect any major impact on culture of organizations through ownership structures? So, for example, she was really thinking about PE companies and the impact you have of having a second party who's very deeply involved with your business.
Yes, I think the answer is yes, but to explain that a little bit, I think that the more transparent an organization is, then better the culture is likely to be. And I think that whereas there are obviously there are a number of disadvantages of being a public company, there are advantages in that certain information has to be shared. And I think that as we go forwards, I think that even PE companies will realize that there are benefits. And I think there are some that are already doing that to a certain degree, realizing that there are benefits in, one, being transparent, and two, which is really important, is distributing this leadership. I think we've become far too centralized. And in fact, software that was sort of invented, if you like, in the 90s and has encroached on society more and more, should have enabled us to become more decentralized. The reality is that it's become more centralized.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks for that. And so there's a question that's a bit related to the previous question, I think, which is, do you have any advice for an employee on helping a bad senior executive or someone who's difficult?
Yes.
Is there anything any sort of words of wisdom that you could share with us?
Well, yes, I think there are. I mean, I've always been a great believer that that leading upwards is as important as leading downwards. But it's not about, generally, it's not just about going to a leader and giving advice, particularly if it's somebody who has a high ego. But if you can identify the weaknesses of that individual and you believe that you possess the capability and the characteristics to fill that gap, then if you can do that at the same time showing loyalty to that person, so that you're a friend and a colleague, then they will start to maybe learn from your success as well and what you're offering to them. That's the way I would suggest doing it. And I can think in my career where I've had some success in that. And I think that's the way to go forward.
Okay. Well, great. Is there, audience, any more questions before we start to wrap up? So I think you've given people an awful lot of food for thought here. And so before we end, I'd really like to thank the audience for your attention and the questions and taking part in the polls, and draw your attention to some of the upcoming events that we have on the website. And naturally, we can only really do this because of our wonderful sponsors, and they're up on the screen in front of you now. And there are at least 2 events coming up this week. One on crypto scams, and the other one, I think, a bit related to here, talking about maturity in the boardroom, which might be a nice companion to John's talk. And this time next week, there is a webinar on management consulting and saving it from itself, which I think will be of huge interest to several of us who are either attending or hosting this webinar today. And finally, I'd really like to give a huge round of applause virtually to John Knights, for sharing all these wonderful models with us. And I'll certainly be downloading this set of slides and thinking about some of the contents in it. So thanks very much, everybody, and hope to see you all soon.
Thank you. Thank you very much.